Welcome to Native Yoga Toddcast. My name is Todd McLaughlin. I'm really excited today to bring a guest on the show today whose name is Eric Shaw, and he has appeared on the podcast before. You can check him out on episode 84. He's an author of this book, Sacred Thread, a comprehensive yoga timeline, 2000 events that shaped yoga history. And so Eric's going to be joining us here very soon. I just wanted to get the intro here for you so I can cover some of our bases. If you're interested in getting a copy of Eric's book, check out in the description. There's a link where you can find the ability to purchase it via Amazon. And also, you'll see in the description as well a couple things that we have available here at Native Yoga Center. If you're new to practicing with us, we do offer 2 weeks free live stream unlimited yoga. And so you'll see a link there where you can click and check it out. If you would like to listen to other episodes of Native Yoga Toddcast, you can visit our website, nativeyogacenter.com. On there, we have a whole bunch of episodes. I believe this one will be episode number, it's going to be past 100, I believe. All right. And so thank you so much for offering your support. What I'm excited about today that's a little different, that is a first time for me, is to have a guest on the show for a live stream. So if you're tuning in via either YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, and or LinkedIn, there's the ability for you to comment. If you are tuned in and you leave me a comment, I'd love to know that you're listening. You just post a comment. Now, during the discussion with Eric, I'll be fielding questions. So if you have any questions for Eric, anywhere around the idea or subject matter of yoga philosophy, please feel free to add them in. Let me go ahead and add Eric to the show. Eric, how are you? Are you able to hear me? I'll give you a moment to set up your audio and video and give me a thumbs up if you
Can you
hear me. I can. Are you there? Looks like your screen froze.
hear me?
I can hear you, except that we're getting a little bit of the screen freezing. Although talk a little bit, let me see if it clears up. So I'm not sure how our Wi-Fi connection is going to go today. Are you able to hear me? I see you
Yeah.
smiling.
Now it's smooth.
There it
Yeah,
is.
it's
I
smooth. Can
hear
you hear
that.
me? Can,
I can.
uh, all
Yeah,
right.
really good,
All
actually. Are you
right.
able to hear me at all?
Yeah, you're
Are
totally
you?
clear.
All right, awesome,
You're
Eric.
totally clear?
Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear. I'm glad you're able to hear me.
All right. Good, good.
Cool. Cool,
Uh
man.
reviewing
Well,
reviewing
all right.
our
I'm getting. Oh yeah, cool.
questions.
You're
All right.
reviewing our questions. Yeah, I kind of got a few questions lined up for you and gave you a heads up as to what I would be asking today. And so I already made an intro, Eric, and I let everybody know that you're a return guest, that you're on the podcast for episode 84. I did make mention that
Mhm.
I have a copy of your book here and that I'd be asking questions based on some of the events that you have recorded here in your book. And on that note, though, before we begin, I just want to check in with you and see how you're doing.
Doing good. I had kind of some unexpected things this morning, some rush, but I'm feeling present.
Yay. Great to hear. I've let everybody that's listening know that if they're tuning in live, if they have any questions or comments, they can tap them in. And throughout the discussion,
Yeah.
I'll field them and ask them your way. You know, to get started, I noticed that you've broken the book down, your book, into different time periods within our history of yoga. And one of the sections is the beginnings, the pre-common era.
Yeah.
And
So
what I'm gonna go ahead and do.
you just want to dive. Okay, so you've already done your intro, so
Yeah,
we're just
I've
gonna
already
dive
done
right
it.
into the hard
Yeah.
scrabble details here. Okay.
Yeah. Yep. Unless you feel like there's a way to
Okay.
soften the experience for our listeners, if there's something that you want to add before we get started.
Yeah, I mean, I did you, in your intro, did you just talk about the composition of the book and maybe a few more general details
No, I'd
or
like for
not?
you to do that now, actually.
Okay. Yeah, why don't we just do that? So I don't know if folks out there heard our first little telecast here, and I talked a little bit about the genesis of the book. It started as kind of an aid to my own studies back in 2004 when I started a doctoral program at California Institute of Integral Studies, and was focusing on yoga history and philosophy and the kind of the culture of India. I my mind kind of thinks in terms of timelines, and so if I can organize cultural information, religious, information, um, artistic information about all the disciplines, the humanities disciplines in my mind in a timeline, that's how I see stuff. I can understand it and put it in its place and see the evolution and see a context in which things fit. So this book is kind of fruition of that process. I started that process in 2004, published a smaller document of about 40 pages on my website and around maybe 210, and then knew that this was material for a book. And about 2 years ago, maybe a little longer now, I started organizing it into book form, formatting it, and expanding it to cover material that I knew was left out. A lot of kind of vital threads that I know that are maybe key to people's conversations and key to the history in general. And so I expanded, cleared it 250 pages, which is nice, which is a
Nice.
solid book length. And then I put it out. And Todd was kind enough to interview me once, and we had actually an excellent conversation. I deeply enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you.
And
Me too.
I think he shared some of that feeling. And so here we are again. And we thought about how to frame this conversation kind of differently than the previous one. And Todd said, oh, how about if or maybe we both came up with the idea of coming up with some key points that we might focus on from the whole range of about 5,000 years that the book covers in little kind of increments, kind of tweet-like moments. So we'll focus on about, I guess, 5 or 6 of those tweets, and maybe I'll be able to say something substantial.
Yes. Thank you, Eric. I appreciate you giving a
Yeah,
little bit more context for how we came up with this idea here of
yeah,
discussing. And so, thank you, Michael. I see that you chimed in. It's great to see you as well. So, where I wanted to begin is at the beginning. And you had made mention, Eric, you said, go ahead and you could just like flip through the book and you could just pick any sentence in there and
yeah,
I would be able to expound upon it. However, I
yeah,
did prep you with a couple that I found interesting. There's a lot
yeah,
of information in here that I've never come across. So I went ahead and picked a couple that maybe the audience is familiar with and maybe some that they aren't. On
yeah,
that
yeah,
note, the first one that I'll read from and see if you can expound a little bit is from the beginnings of pre-common era, where it says around 2900, the date for the creation of the steatite postage stamp sized Pashupati seals found in the remnants of the Indus-Saraswati culture. The most detailed of these provides numerous suggestions of yogic norms, including an upright, broad chested sitting posture, hand gestures, mudras, upward pointing chevrons, suggesting upward thrusting prana, many faces associated with godlike omniscience. There's a Kundalini Kriya, there's foothills at the anus, looking like the Bhadrasana pose. So it keeps going and going on that note. it's not a really long one, but a little longer than some of the other sentence-like ones. I guess I wanted to ask you if you could shed some light on the Pashupati seals and on the level of when we gauge how old yoga is, why
Yeah.
that's significant.
Yeah. Let me just read the rest of the entry. I think it's worthwhile.
Please, please.
Um, Foothills of the anus, looking like Vajrasana pose, a Kundalini spiking position, comma, animals in attendance, suggestive of one who commands the primal or biological powers, and a three-horned headdress, suggestive of the Trishula marker of the Yoga Shaivite cult. That means they worship Shiva, which seems to define the image as the earliest representation of a yogic practitioner. What each detail and the picture itself might actually mean is hotly debated, but it seems to this author, that's me, that it's a clear case of folks failing to see the forest for the trees. The Pashupati images come together with small terracotta sculptures of figures in simple yoga poses from that same place and time to make a strong argument for yoga's early origins in the ISC, the Indus-Sarasvati culture. So, um, you know, it's interesting to me the knowledge of history that's permeated the yoga world, and a lot of this stuff is not as critical as when came up in the tradition, and maybe you as well, Todd. It seems that we've really departed from yoga's roots in India and to a great deal, and taken on yoga as an American evolute. Fair enough, cultures do that. Within one generation, we can easily forget the origins of even an entire people, and you see this throughout history. So, but having said that, I mean, history is fascinating to me, and it's still fascinating to a great number of people, and it's valuable to some kind of nation in which we're taking part. And the Pashupati seal is key in this conversation because it is our earliest of from the historical record. Um, is my I'm seeing my screen stop a little bit. Are all my words getting through?
Actually, it did give a little latency where there's a
Yeah,
few like kind of pauses. So I know I was just thinking the same thing, Eric, but that's the
yeah,
Wi-Fi strength we're in right now. So I think let's go ahead and
yeah.
continue and see if it smooths out a little bit.
Okay, yeah, you're slowing down a little for me too. Um, so, so the Pashupati seal is key. It's key because it really is our sui generis moment. It's the moment at which we see what I think is quite clear evidence of yoga practice in physical evidence in an ancient culture, which we have a lot of evidence on. All that evidence is archaeological. There are no real texts from that period. Paper doesn't tend to survive quite that long, 2,900 years before the birth of Christ, which is about 5,000 years back. So these seals, as we've described in that description, have so many markers of what we have come to associate with the range of yoga practices over the last 5,000 years. A lot of that material is referenceable to the last 1,000 years, but what we do know about the Indian culture is it is incredibly durable. It maintains in not an exactly unchanged form, but because it's a very orthodox culture, it's actually both. It's a very orthodox culture and what we call a heterodox culture. It's a culture that holds on very strongly to its ancient forms and reduplicates those and practices them in many ways that were authentic to the way they were practiced thousands of years ago. And it introduces new material and new forms of approaching those same practices. But because we know that endurance quality, we can, I think, justifiably take valid information from the visual evidence of this seal to suggest that not only was there yoga happening 5,000 years ago in this culture, which has other markers of Hindu culture in general, but that it was a range of practices that were perhaps as complexified as what we find in the later historical tradition. Um, I mean, I could read that description again. It's there in the book if you decide to explore it. But I've thought that it would make a fascinating article from an actual yoga practitioner who's explored, subtle energy and the way that we talk about it in the tradition, to go through step by step every iconographical moment in that small little stamp-sized seal and point to what speaks to the yoga tradition. It's, subtle technologies, it's physical technologies, it's iconography, it's mythology. It's all kind of there in that little seal. So it was a wonderful discovery. It was found by Sir James Marshall, an amateur British archaeologist, in 1929, and he named it the Pashupati seal, which means Lord of the Animals. And that's all, material that he put on it from the outside. But I think his interpretation for its time was sufficiently valid. And there's a lot more, many interesting things we can say about that seal in terms of the yoga history that we know now.
Nice.
Yeah.
Can you explain a little bit more what the shape that the person that's sitting on the seal is in?
Yeah. So he's sitting there with his arms outstretched, broad chest, feet seemingly with the heels touching and the toes pointing down. And he's what we call ithyphallic. He has an erect penis, and that is a sign of fertility. And it's also a yoga kriya that's been described by people who have gone through Kundalini awakening. And its triangular form. And I don't know how many of my listeners out there are meditators, but most common meditation positions are in a triangular form. And the reason they're in that form is because when we take such forms, or when such forms are created in nature, energy moves up.
Mm.
Anytime you create any vertical form, energy moves up through that form. That's partly part of our experience as human beings, as upright human beings. So to assume that particular position, which has a wide base, is rooted into the kind of biological life force of the planet, and brings that to the peak, as we do in so many yoga poses, but that one particularly so, you're going to be bringing life force up into the higher energy centers. And that's a kind of a basic Kundalini technology, basic yoga technology.
Nice.
Yeah.
Very cool. Is there what are the arguments against this theory that this is the original or the oldest representation of yoga that we have?
Well, the scholarly sphere strives on the breadth of understanding and interpretation. So, it's good for any conclusion to be challenged by people with different opinions, and definitely informed opinions. So, some people say, oh, we see kings in this position. He's just a king on a dais. He's just a king on a throne. It's even gone so far as to say that it's a female figure, though I think that's quite a speculative argument. There's not a lot about it that suggests it's a female figure. But all kinds of arguments to say that it's merely a secular representation. It's not necessarily religious, and it's definitely not necessarily yogic. And, it's as valid as far as it goes, because we don't have any accompanying text. We don't know, we don't have a richer realm of descriptive information around the seal from that period. So it's all speculation. You know, I think that speculation doesn't have as much to stand on as an argument that says that it's for the yoga tradition.
Mm.
Yeah.
Cool. If we go into the next era that you broke it into, the common era to 1799,
Big
I'd
big chunk of
actually
history there.
that's a big chunk of history, and I had sent you a different, one than the one I'm gonna bring up here, because as I was flipping
Okay.
through while I was waiting, I figured I'd just surprise you, and,
All right.
I believe you'll have plenty to say about this, but
Okay. Go ahead, read it
in,
out and give
alright,
us the year.
in 50, the year 50,
Yeah.
it says the date for the composition of the Mundaka, meaning shaved head, Upanishad of the Atharva Veda. The Mundaka offers an attack on the Vedas, ritualism, and the classic disciplines of Hindu religiosity, pointing to mystical potentialities that possess greater power. Within a cosmology of karmic imperatives, it dismisses good works and focuses on knowledge as the only means to transcendence, while praising renunciation and the identity of the seer.
Yeah.
So I guess the first thing it made me think is that there was an attack on the Vedas, or maybe an opposing view shape. And I was wondering if you could first explain the Veda, or give a very brief history of the Vedas, or what the Vedas represent, or the place the Vedas hold in India history and philosophy. And then from there, I'll ask a little more around this, but maybe we could start with that one.
Okay. So there's a lot to talk about there. So the Vedas are 4 books that are the root texts of the Hindu tradition. That doesn't mean that they're the most read text. The most read text is the Bhagavad Gita, but which comes about, say, 1400 years later. So these books, the Atharva Veda, Samaveda, Rig Veda, and Rig, Sama, Atharva, and these texts are large complexes of small texts within them that are chants, commentaries on ritual, descriptions of how to practice ritual, discussions of how to prepare for ritual, stories, descriptions of the gods, dialogues from the gods. They're kind of a hodgepodge, and a lot of these older texts are compilations, just like the Bible. We think about the Bible has all the things I just mentioned. It has rules and restrictions and stories and history, and it's all cobbled together in a text that we deem in the West, still with our degree of secularity, you might still say the holiest text of our tradition. So those are India, and they're much richer and much vaster, but though they come from about the same period, 1200 years before the Common Era. So when we talk about that time note, we're talking about an orthodox tradition in which the main practice is Buddhism itself. So if we can point to, one of the key technologies of the Indian religious tradition, it's ritual. And ritual takes place on so many levels in that tradition, but it's rooted in this deep investment in the variety of ritualistic practices that come out of the Vedas and are described in the Vedas in great detail. So that tradition is usually opposed to the there is a informational matrix in which they talk to each other, and there is a borrowing of metaphors from the ritualistic descriptions for what actually happens in the individualized body and the yoga process. But ritualism is a social extroverted form. It's what we call exoteric, whereas yoga is an introverted esoteric form. And that's one of the primary binaries of the Indian tradition as it evolves from its beginnings. What's going on at a purely mystical internal level for individuals and informs the tradition and brings people to certain states of apotheosis, certain states of enlightenment, and what's going on in context, which brings people together, enforces social morals, enforces proper behavior, gives people a common religious and cultural language. Those are 2 different spheres, and we know them in every discussion. There's experience as Newton described it inside our 5 senses, and what happens outside of our 5 senses within the social. So the Upanishad does, it's not terribly exclusive to this Upanishad as opposed to other Upanishads. The Upanishads in general are introducing their audiences to that mystical yogic worldview.
Got it.
They're talking about the laws of karma, how your actions act your becoming, and your ultimate shift from death into a new life. So it's introducing new concepts, and the general concept is this concept of quote unquote knowledge, which we might talk about as vijnana or prajna. So that's what the Mundaka is giving us. It's giving us a similar argument or testimony, we might say, to a reality that we find in the breadth of what we call the Mukhya Upanishads, the primary Upanishads, is, depending on who you talk to, there's 10 or 12 or so, that are seen as most holy and most informational, most valid, whose testimony rings truest in our minds. Sort of like when we talk about the Bible and we talk about the good news, or it feels new, it feels fresh because
Mm,
it's so relevant to our human existential struggle or experience. It speaks to us, across the centuries. So we see that in the Mundaka and all the other Upanishadic texts. Some of the unique things about the Mundaka is that it comes so late. The earliest Upanishads are dated, depending on who you talk to, 600 to 400 years before the birth of Christ. This one is dated after the birth of Christ. So
mm,
it's attributed to the Atharva Veda, which is the last Veda of the series, but that's questionable as to whether it actually came out of some conversation with that text. A lot of these later Upanishads are just kind of tacked on to the Atharva Veda because it was the latest Veda. But the key thing we can take from an understanding of the Mundaka is it is another testimony to the primary validity of mystical, individualized, esoteric experience, and one that attempts to kind of take the wind out of the sails of Vedic ritualism, of the kind of more socialized practices that are related to
mm.
ritual and what we learned in the Vedas.
Is
Yeah.
there any speculation or knowledge about what the catalyst might have been that would have created that transition to go from, say, external rituals to internal rituals? Or I've heard it explained that way, that the Vedas were more of like a external ritualization or explaining external rituals, and that the Upanishads highlight this transition from, say, we could create an external fire and there'd be someone tending the fire and keeping the fire going, and then maybe the Upanishads highlights that we can generate an internal fire, and that maybe keeping the fire going would be through
Yeah.
our meditative practices. Is that is that true? Do I have that right?
Yeah, you've got that very right. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you
So
know
the
what the
Genesis, we might say,
was?
which
Yeah,
is,
yeah.
sorry,
Sorry.
you
Go ahead.
blurted out there. Say that again.
Oh no, I was just
No,
gonna
no, go ahead.
say,
You can do it. Follow up.
what you thought, or what the thought is around maybe the catalyst, like where that, what would have
Yeah.
spawned that transition?
Yeah, actually, my professor Jim Ryan, who I studied under at California Institute of Integral Studies, was kind of a leader in some of the theory around that, and his understanding, which is I think is that it was being in city culture that forced a different kind of style of internalization rather than what was in the previous Vedic period focused on a more agrarian culture. So
Mm,
if we think about city life, and most individuals now in the planet live in urban centers,
mm,
so we're all in many ways veterans of this, especially if you're listening to a program such as this. Um, when we live in city life, we are forced into relationship with the other people on the streets. We see people of different nationalities. We see people with different kinds of physical features. We see different people with different sets of beliefs. And so the kind of blanket understanding that comes in a small agrarian tribal culture where you're not faced with too much contradiction, you don't have a rich cultural dialogue, you can have one set of beliefs that can remain unchallenged from life until death, is a very different experience from what we have in a city context where we're seeing someone as like us, but by extension see ourselves with that same
mm.
objectivity.
Yeah, that's
That
interesting.
you nec- have, yeah, isn't that the logic there is kind of incontrovertible. Once we
Mm,
see that, we see much more of the emergence of ego. It's not no longer so much a tribal identity. You're no longer identified by your relationship to your family or your tribe. You're identified more by who you are as a discrete human body.
mm.
Yeah. because I'm kind of
That's
forced to see
yeah,
that. I
yeah,
see other human beings as we think about it, walking down the street. Myself am walking down the street. I am alien to them, and they are alien to me. So it
yes.
enforces a style of self-reflection that is lacking in a context where there's constant agreement.
Interesting.
So
Yeah.
that kind of creates the existential conversation, and it starts, it makes us answer questions about life and death in a much more strict sense, because my
Mm,
relatively immortal. The family will live forever, but I, as a person, the single line segment of my life from beginning to end is definable and finite and raises questions about what that life means, what happens
mm,
when that life ends, and then how do I optimize whatever goals or experiences or pattern me that are in that span. And that's the taproot for mystical investigation, which leads to technologies like yoga.
mm. Interesting. Do you feel like the transition to the type of practice that we're experiencing in our modern culture here has taken several more steps of transition? Like, uh, you know, do you feel like that the yoga of the Upanishads is pretty close to the yoga that we might be practicing in the city life here in current modern culture?
What do you think?
I'm thinking no, because we're still have this huge span of time between then and now, but
Yeah,
the way that you kind of explained that there was maybe this not removal from nature, because when I
yeah,
imagine this long ago, just the fact that you're talking about it's like this transition from tribal culture into city life,
yeah,
and so I'm trying to imagine a city 1,000 years ago in India,
yeah,
what that would look like in relation to, say, a city currently in either
yeah.
India or America. Surely it must have changed. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, those some of those primary particulars that I pointed to were the same, right? You're
Mm,
in a
yep, yep.
mix, a kind of alien mix. I mean, you might be in your little borough or you might be in your little neighborhood where you're familiar with people. But if it's a city of some size, it's going to attract traders from other parts of the world, even in those days. It's going to attract farmers who come into market from different areas of the country. And in those days, because there was less travel, even those little areas can be quite alien to one another. I mean, we see
Yep,
the bifurcation of language in like Europe, where every small pocket has its own little dialect. That's happened all over the world, wherever there was not a great deal of intermixing or movement.
yep,
So in any city of any size, generally you're gonna have that existential encounter because of the nature of space.
yep, yep.
Yeah,
Nice. Awesome. I wanna
yeah,
jump ahead a little bit and go to the page on page 30 in the year 15. Actually, is that the one I was looking at? I wanna check because the date of yeah, this is the one that I sent you. On 1550, date for the composition of Vijnana Bhikshu's Yoga Sutras commentary, the Yoga Vartika exposition on yoga. The author frames Patanjali's practices as compatible with Vedantic ones, even as he draws on the rich mythologies of Puranic literature to inform his evaluative method. The Vedantic idea of Beda, meaning difference and non-difference, is utilized extensively to interpret Patanjali's goals and methods. Maybe you could shed a little light on what you mean by that. I guess the first thing I thought that was interesting that the Yoga Sutras that this author is saying that they're compatible with the Vedantic ones. And so, in relation to what you were speaking about the Vedas, how would we make a comparison for the teachings in the Yoga Sutras to the Vedas?
Okay. So, a context that will help us kind of understand this entry is that Vedanta is, in a way, the primary philosophy of Indian religiosity. It is associated with householder life and social life, even though it's quite extreme. Um, it puts a huge emphasis on this idea of knowledge, deeper mystical knowledge, though it describes it in very mundane terms. And those terms are that when we see nature of Brahman, however you choose to conceive that, we see all of this instantly. It's sort of like a car drives in front of me, I can't not see the car. Once I've seen it, I know the car exists. So
Yep.
that's
Yep.
sort of the general for describing how the philosophy of Vedanta unfolds. Is that once we see the true nature of Brahman, of reality, of the deepest actual reality, everything else is illusion. It's a very
Yes.
strict and I think, as it's expressed, quite intellectual framing of universal experience. So that's Vedanta. So, but that is not Patanjali. Patanjali's work comes, maybe at that point we're like, 1500 years out from the Vedas. A lot has happened in that time. The Upanishads have, and their ideas have gained currency, and then Patanjali's in a position to comment on the Upanishads. Some people
Mm.
say that the Upanishads are all about Vedanta, that they're not about yoga. And both those views have their validity. The Brahma Sutra, which was written about the year one, let's say, um, argues that the Veda or the Upanishads were all about Vedanta. And then Shankaracharya, the great teacher of Vedanta, who comes in the 7th century, makes that same argument as he writes a commentary on both the Yoga Sutras and the Brahma Sutras and the Upanishads. So that's one set of ideas. Vedanta is the main way to see the world. It's in a way it's dualistic in that there's both Maya and then there's the reality of Brahman. But really, it's not dualistic. It describes itself as a non dual philosophy because only one of those things, Brahman, is real. The other thing is just retrograde. It's something we completely dismiss. Either you're seeing things rightly or you're not seeing things at all.
Yeah.
And and but within we can't avoid duality. I mean, as much as there's all this talk, because the
Ooh, I'm so
bicycles
sorry. Oh,
we
yeah.
can have this.
Sorry, Eric. There was a lot of like Wi-Fi glitch going on there, so I apologize. I did not
It's
hear
okay.
much in the last few seconds. All right, but I am following you. I just wanted to let you know that if you come back in and you're wondering why I'm not saying anything, it's because I missed a little bit
Yeah.
there. All right, I'm sorry.
Yeah. What was the last thing I was saying? What was the last thing I was?
Oh, man. Good point. You had kind of clarified that there was, within these 5 elements, one is seeing reality, that's it, everything else is not reality. That goes way back to, like, a whole minute and a half ago.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I'm having difficulty hearing you too. It's coming in and out.
I know, Eric, man, I'm so sorry. I don't know what's going on with our Wi-Fi. Mine's showing like full Wi-Fi
Yeah.
bars, and I'm feeling like the quality of the conversation is it's being challenged a little bit because of the spaces in between. Did you hear everything I just said, or did you get some of the same thing I was getting when I was listening to you?
Huh.
Oh man, yeah,
Do
I
we
know.
need to jump to another format again?
I have a feeling that we are probably going to need to get a really clear audio recording. What I will do is like I feel like I want to keep going, but at the same time, I want to make sure that we get like a decent sort of sound quality so that people that get a chance to listen also on the podcast release that
Yeah.
it'll be clear enough where it won't be distracting or frustrating to listen because you're saying some amazing things. You have some great insights. If I'm not able to get the full sentence in, though, it's difficult to follow because there's some pretty intellectually orientated ideas going on here.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
my
sense
thoughts,
is
yeah,
that we should be, for the sake of the material, that we should
yeah,
abandon this medium. That's my sense. It's
y-
just kind of not working.
yeah, yeah. I agree with
Yeah.
you. All right. Well, on that note,
And I'm
what?
game to start over. I mean, I don't have anything scheduled today. Should we do that?
Okay, on that note,
Should we
let's
talk on the phone?
convene. Yeah, let's talk on the phone here. But for anyone listening currently, thank you for being patient. I apologize for any technical difficulties. We're going to go ahead and sign off here now, and we will reconvene the conversation and make it in a format that's going to be really easy to follow. All right. On that note, thank you. And I will call you right now, Eric. All right.